After a 30-year career, Daniel Brooks finally found peace in his family's rustic cabin, a sanctuary he restored with his own hands. Then, the Lakeshore Homeowners Association sent him a letter. It wasn't a welcome notice. It was a demand: move his cabin 20 feet or face legal action. This is the story of how one man's retirement became a war against the very neighborhood trying to erase him. On HOA Unfiltered. It was a gray morning in late October when Daniel first noticed the envelope in his mailbox. The paper was heavy, embossed with the familiar but unwelcome insignia of the Lakeshore Homeowners Association. He carried it into the cabin with his groceries, setting it on the kitchen table beside a sack of apples and a loaf of bread. For a while he ignored it, but eventually he poured himself coffee, slit the envelope carefully with a knife, and unfolded the thick letter inside. The words were at once absurd and threatening. The letter informed him that his cabin encroached upon common ground belonging to the association, and that he would be required to relocate the structure no less than 20 feet to the east. The phrasing was cold, bureaucratic, as though moving a house were no more difficult than rearranging lawn furniture, accompanied by veiled warnings of fines, legal action, and even forced removal. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time, each repetition feeding a rising wave of incredulity and anger. He laughed at the absurdity, but the laughter died in his throat as a cold, professional dread took hold. He'd seen this tactic before. This wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration of war. The cabin that now stood threatened had been Daniel's refuge from a world that had stolen more from him than it had given. After 30 years of relentless deadlines at his Chicago architectural firm, design competitions, and endless battles with clients who only cared about cost efficiency, he had promised himself that retirement would be different. When his uncle's old cabin by the lake in northern Michigan fell into his hands, he didn't hesitate for a second. This wasn't just a cabin anymore. The polished beam where his uncle had carved his initials, the stone hearth that had warmed his family for generations, it was a living scrapbook of summers spent here as a boy, when the world still felt infinite and uncomplicated. Every board carried a memory of fishing trips, smoky campfires, and evenings when his uncle would sit on the porch swing, telling improbable stories that a child was willing to believe. And now a bureaucrat with a stamp was threatening to tear the whole page out. The structure itself was nothing extraordinary at first glance. Rough cedar beams darkened with age, a pitched roof that sagged slightly at the ridge, and a stone chimney patched a dozen times by different hands over the decades. Yet to Daniel, it was more than shelter. It was a fragment of family history, a tangible reminder of everything pure he had left. When Daniel arrived with his modest savings, he refused to demolish the cabin or modernize it into something glossy. He drew up his own plans, sketches that balanced preservation and reinforcement, working with local carpenters to restore the structure with care. He insisted on reusing the original beams where possible, polishing them until the old resin shone again, keeping the heavy stone hearth as the focal point of the single large room. The work was slow and exhausting, but it gave him a sense of purpose that reminded him architecture had once been about craft before it became about paperwork.
The cabin slowly transformed into a place that was both functional and soulful, a retreat where he could live out the rest of his days without interference. Daniel was meticulous about every detail, filing every deed, every survey, every letter connected to the property into a heavy leather binder. He studied county maps late into the night, verifying that the borders of his parcel hadn't changed since the 1970s. Even in retirement, he couldn't let go of his professional instincts. He measured distances, checked alignments, made sure the foundation stones sat firmly within the legal limits of his lot. He enjoyed the thought that no bureaucrat, no developer, no association could ever question his right to live here.
The lake community had changed since his childhood visits. Back then, there had been only a scattering of seasonal cottages, simple wooden homes like his uncle's. But the last 2 decades brought waves of suburban expansion. What had once been quiet shoreline was now a paved street lined with nearly identical houses, most owned by families who spent half the year in the city. With this came the rise of a homeowners association, faceless bureaucrats who fancied themselves guardians of order and property values. Daniel knew of them, of course. One couldn't live here without hearing their name whispered with irritation or grudging respect. But he considered himself safe from their reach. His cabin predated the development. His property had never been enrolled in the association, and his uncle had made certain the deeds were separate from any later incorporations. It was precisely this independence that Daniel cherished. He could paint his shutters dark green if he wished, plant wildflowers instead of manicured lawns, watch the sunset without wondering whether some committee would find fault with the angle of his porch railing. But now, staring at their demand, Daniel felt the old unease settle deeper in his bones, the awareness that a battle had begun, one he had not chosen, but could no longer avoid. The phone call only deepened his unease. When he reached the association office after being shuffled between secretaries who spoke with rehearsed politeness, he was finally connected to a man who identified himself as a compliance officer. Daniel explained calmly that his cabin had been built decades before the subdivision, that he possessed the original deed and survey, and that the demand to move it was based on a false assumption. The man's voice remained detached, even courteous, but there was no trace of flexibility in his words. Our records show, he repeated more than once, that your structure encroaches upon land designated for common use. Daniel pressed him for specifics, but each time the officer retreated into formulaic answers, advising that if Daniel wished to contest the determination, he could request a formal review through the association's legal committee. A process that could take months and would not suspend the penalties for noncompliance. Daniel hung up the phone, his hand trembling not with fear, but with a slow-burning rage. They weren't listening. So he would have to find a language they understood, cold, hard, undeniable facts. That evening he pulled out his binder of documents, spreading papers across the worn surface of the dining table until the room was covered with maps, deeds, notarized letters, and photocopies of surveys old and new. He ran his finger over the lines that marked his boundaries, lines that hadn't changed in half a century, and he felt a grim satisfaction in their clarity. Yet alongside the satisfaction came unease, for he knew that truth on paper was one thing and power in practice another. The following days brought no relief. A second letter arrived, even sterner, reminding him of the deadline by which compliance must be demonstrated, attaching a schedule of fines designed to accumulate, a slow bleed that could stretch into thousands if left unresolved. Daniel laughed bitterly when he read it, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed everything he had feared. He could picture the board meeting where his name had been raised, the smug expressions of men and women who believed themselves custodians of order, deciding that the quiet architect in the old cabin would be an easy target. They didn't know him. The shock gave way to a grim determination he hadn't felt in years. Each time he walked the perimeter of his property, each time he stood on the porch looking out at the lake, he felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him, as though the land itself were contested ground. The neighbors still greeted him politely, but he noticed a subtle shift in their expressions, a hint of curiosity or caution, as if they already knew something of the dispute. One night, unable to sleep, he lit a fire and sat before the flames with the letter in his hands, reading it yet again. The absurd demand to move the cabin 20 feet glared up at him, a monument to arrogance, and he whispered aloud to the empty room that he would never do it. He would not allow them to dictate the fate of the home his uncle had built, the home he had restored with his own hands, the home that stood precisely where it was meant to stand. He had faced the pressure of clients with millions on the line. He had faced city officials who tried to twist regulations for their allies. And he had never once surrendered when he knew he was right. He would not surrender now, not to a committee of neighbors wielding clipboards and bylaws like weapons. The decision to hire a professional surveyor was not made lightly, for Daniel had long prided himself on his own precision. But he knew that if the faceless bureaucracy intended to press the matter, he would need independent verification that could withstand their scrutiny. When the team arrived one brisk morning with their tripods, lasers, and measuring rods, Daniel felt a flicker of relief, certain that within hours the entire absurdity would be put to rest. But what he found in those archives was more than a defense. It was a weapon that would turn the entire case upside down. When the surveyor returned several days later with a neatly bound report, the results were anything but routine. The document began with expected notations, confirming the dimensions of Daniel's property as recorded in county archives, but then it shifted into a conclusion that left him staring at the page in disbelief. Not only did his cabin sit comfortably within the rightful boundaries, but the association's paved street and a long row of houses built within the past 20 years actually intruded across his line by several yards. The truth was staggering. The neighborhood, with its perfectly paved streets and identical houses, was built on a lie. They weren't the guardians of order, they were squatters in suits, and they had built their kingdom on land that belonged to him. For several minutes, he could do nothing but sit at the table, the report trembling in his hands as cold clarity settled over him. He suddenly understood that this was no simple misunderstanding, no clerical error, but a conflict that cut to the foundation of the community itself. Armed with the report, he walked into the association's monthly meeting, a gathering held in a converted community hall where folding chairs were arranged in neat rows and the air carried the stale odor of coffee brewed too early. Residents sat murmuring among themselves until Lawrence Pike, the board's president, called the meeting to order, his voice practiced and authoritative. Daniel waited until the appropriate moment, then rose and presented his findings, laying the survey on the table with deliberate calm. At first there was silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers as Pike skimmed the pages, his brow tightening with each line. Then came the forced laugh, brittle and strained, as he declared that the survey must be mistaken, that no one in their right mind would believe such an outrageous claim. Daniel stood firm, explaining the methodology, pointing to the county's original plats that matched the surveyor's conclusions, and he watched as the confidence drained from some faces in the crowd, replaced by unease and the faintest glimmer of fear. The room shifted as whispers spread, neighbors glancing at one another with dawning comprehension of what the report implied. If Daniel was correct, then entire properties, including their carefully manicured lawns, their fences, even parts of their houses, rested on land that didn't belong to them. Pike attempted to regain control, raising his voice, insisting that the matter was closed until verified by the association's own experts. But the authority that once seemed absolute now rang hollow. One man in the back muttered something about property values. A woman clutched her purse as if expecting the floor to give way, and Daniel, though calm on the surface, felt a deep shift in the balance of power, as if the ground beneath the association itself had begun to crumble. In the days that followed, the hostility became more personal. The association sent another letter, this one curt and dismissive, declaring that Daniel's survey was unofficial and irrelevant until reviewed by their chosen professionals. But the tone had sharpened, no longer bureaucratic detachment, but something closer to threat. Neighbors who had once offered polite greetings now avoided his eyes, and he could feel the invisible weight of suspicion pressing against him. One afternoon, while walking the perimeter of his lot, he noticed a fresh stake driven into the ground, painted in bright colors used by survey crews, yet it didn't match any line from the official records. Someone had quietly attempted to redraw the boundary as though repetition alone could make it truth. He removed the stake and carried it back to his porch, laying it across the steps like evidence, a reminder that the fight had moved beyond letters into the physical landscape. More troubling still was the subtle shift in atmosphere at the grocery store and post office, where Daniel overheard fragments of conversation that made clear the association was shaping a narrative against him. Words like troublemaker and opportunist drifted on the air, and though no one confronted him directly, the isolation was more suffocating than outright hostility. He recognized the tactic from his professional years. If you cannot win on facts, you undermine credibility. You plant doubt until even allies hesitate to stand beside you. But what he found in those archives was more than a defense. It was a weapon that would turn the entire case upside down. The weeks that followed carried a strange duality. On the surface, life at the cabin remained unchanged, with Daniel rising early to brew his coffee and walking the property lines he knew so well. Yet beneath that quiet routine ran a current of tension that couldn't be ignored. He could feel it each time he drove into town and saw the hesitant expressions of neighbors who no longer greeted him. And he could hear it in the sharp, clipped tone of the association's letters that arrived with unsettling regularity, each one a reminder that the board was not retreating, but instead tightening its grip. The first blows had been struck, but more troubling signs emerged. His mailbox, a sturdy iron fixture that had stood undisturbed for years, was pried open, its door bent awkwardly as though forced with a crowbar. Inside lay no letters, only a scrap of paper on which someone had scrawled the words, "Pay what you owe," in thick black marker. Soon afterward, he began receiving notices from the county sanitation department, each citing alleged violations regarding waste disposal and demanding fines for leaving trash bins in unauthorized locations. Daniel had never once failed to follow collection rules, but the notices kept arriving, each more aggressive than the last until he realized someone within the association had filed repeated complaints under his name. It was not the money that troubled him, though the fines were designed to sting, but the deliberate erosion of his energy, the attempt to drown him in trivialities until he lost the will to fight on matters that truly mattered. At night, he began hearing unfamiliar sounds beyond the tree-line, the crack of branches underfoot, and the low rumble of engines idling on the road. One morning, he discovered fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the mud near the edge of his property, tracks that didn't match his own vehicle and led nowhere but a dead end against the fence line. The message was clear. Others had been here, and they wanted him to know it. More troubling still was when his surveyor, the independent professional whose report had first revealed the encroachment, contacted him to say he could no longer participate in the dispute. The man's voice was strained over the phone, his words halting as he explained that he had received threatening calls late at night, anonymous voices warning him to stay out of community business. Though he wouldn't name names, it was obvious that someone aligned with the association had orchestrated the intimidation. But what unsettled Daniel most was not the outrage of the residents, but the quiet glances exchanged between Pike and the attorney during meetings, looks that suggested a shared understanding of something unsaid. It was not disbelief that troubled them, but recognition, as if they already knew the truth of Daniel's claims and were now scrambling to conceal it. The realization chilled him. This was not a mistake born of incompetence, but a deception sustained by willful silence. By winter's approach, Daniel understood that he was no longer simply defending his cabin, but challenging the legitimacy of an entire neighborhood. The association had shifted tactics in their official communications. They no longer spoke of moving his cabin 20 feet. Instead, they accused him of obstructing community cohesion, of making reckless claims that threatened property values, and of creating hostility among neighbors. Their latest letter warned that if he did not withdraw his assertions and accept a revised boundary agreement that effectively ceded part of his land to the association, they would consider him in violation of their code of conduct and pursue legal remedies that could include liens against his property. Daniel read the letter in silence, marveling at the audacity of a board that claimed jurisdiction over land it had never owned, and he understood that what began as an absurd demand had evolved into an attempt to rewrite the reality of ownership itself. They were no longer simply defending themselves. They were attempting to erase his rights entirely. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing, not because the case was officially high profile, but because word had spread through the community like wildfire. And curiosity had drawn residents who now understood that their own stability might be shaken by whatever was decided. Daniel sat at the petitioner's table, his binder of documents stacked neatly before him, pages worn from endless handling yet still crisp with authority. Across the aisle, Lawrence Pike and the association's attorney whispered to one another in hushed tones, their faces stiff with forced confidence. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for blunt pragmatism, called the session to order, and the room fell silent with the kind of anticipation that vibrates like a taut wire. The association presented its case first, arguing with familiar language of authority that Daniel's cabin violated boundary regulations, insisting that his independent survey was unverified and his claims exaggerated. The attorney produced diagrams prepared by their own hired surveyor, charts that conveniently realigned property lines in ways that excused the association's encroachment and placed the supposed burden back onto Daniel. When Daniel's turn came, he rose slowly, adjusting his glasses, and spoke with the quiet precision of a man who had spent his life in architecture, explaining that structures must be measured not by convenience, but by truth, and that no amount of redrawn diagrams could erase the reality embedded in decades of official maps. He laid out his evidence step by step, beginning with the original deed from the 1970s, followed by county plats certified by public offices long before the association was even conceived. And finally, the independent survey that aligned perfectly with those historical records. The judge leaned forward, studying each document as Daniel slid them across the table, her brow furrowing as the weight of consistency became undeniable. But the true turning point came when Daniel introduced an unexpected piece of evidence he had uncovered during his quiet research: municipal records showing that during the subdivision's formation, certain maps had been filed with dates that didn't correspond to official approvals, suggesting they had been altered after the fact to legitimize construction already underway. The room stirred at the implication, and when Daniel calmly pointed out that it was not his cabin, but the association street and several of its houses that encroached upon his land, the silence that followed was more damning than any outburst could have been. Pike shifted uneasily, his composure cracking, and the attorney attempted to object, claiming irrelevance. But the judge silenced him with a raised hand, demanding clarification. Daniel obliged, presenting copies of correspondence from the municipal office in which questions about the boundary were raised decades earlier and then abruptly dismissed without resolution, as if buried under pressure from eager developers. It became evident that the problem was not new, that it had been deliberately ignored to allow the neighborhood to flourish, and now the truth had returned, undeniable and impossible to suppress. A murmur swelled among the residents seated in the gallery. Some faces pale with shock, others flushed with anger, and a woman near the back whispered loudly enough to be heard. They knew all along. The judge delivered her decision with deliberate clarity, her voice steady as she declared that the association's claims against Daniel were unfounded, that his cabin stood entirely within his lawful property, and that the burden of encroachment lay instead with the association itself. She ordered an immediate suspension of all penalties levied against him and referred the matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into potential fraudulent filings during the subdivision's creation. The words struck the room like a hammer, shattering the illusion of authority that Pike and his allies had clung to, and in that moment the association's carefully maintained facade collapsed under the weight of its own deceit. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in triumph, but in exhausted relief, for he knew the fight was not over, that investigations and negotiations would stretch into the future. But he had stood his ground, and the law had affirmed what he had always known. The cabin was his, the land was his, and no committee could strip it away through lies. In the weeks after the ruling, the neighborhood that had once seemed so solid began to fracture under the weight of revelation. While Daniel had secured his own position, the decision left many residents facing the grim truth that parts of their homes, their driveways, even the very street they drove on every morning rested on land that was never legally theirs. Meetings turned chaotic. Neighbors who once supported the board's authority now demanded answers, and whispers of lawsuits multiplied until the community hall was filled with more suspicion than solidarity. Lawrence Pike resigned quietly, slipping away without a speech or apology, leaving behind a board stripped of legitimacy and residents scrambling to understand what would happen next. For Daniel, the aftermath carried no sweetness of triumph, only the weary satisfaction of knowing that his cabin would remain standing exactly where it had always stood, untouchable now, not by chance, but by the firm weight of law. Some neighbors came to him in awkward truce, speaking cautiously, asking if he would be willing to negotiate easements or partial sales that could stabilize their titles. And though Daniel held every advantage, he chose not to wield it with cruelty. He agreed to discussions, but only on terms that acknowledged his rights fully. Others avoided him altogether, unable to reconcile the image of the quiet architect with the man who had pulled back the curtain on a deception they had unknowingly relied upon for decades. He did not begrudge their silence, for he understood that anger and shame were difficult companions, and he no longer sought their approval. As winter deepened and the lake froze into stillness, Daniel returned to his routines, stacking wood by the porch, repairing shutters, walking the familiar perimeter of his land with the certainty that no one could now challenge what was his. The cabin, once threatened, now stood as a symbol of endurance, its beams dark against the snow, its hearth burning steady at night. The judge's gavel fell, and for the first time in years, the silence that returned to the cabin was a friendly one. No longer the silence of waiting for the next attack, but the deep, profound quiet of a battle finally won. The land, at last, was truly his. In the silence of the evenings, when the fire cracked and the wind howled against the cedar walls, Daniel felt something close to peace, knowing that though the community around him might never fully forgive or forget, the ground beneath his feet belonged to him alone. And that was enough. He did not think of himself as a hero, nor as a conqueror, but simply as a man who refused to be erased. And in that refusal, he had forced the truth into daylight where it could not be hidden again.